Fine. At a time when Christians and Muslims were at war, so much so that many of Cusanus' contemporaries feared the very destruction of European culture, he instead sought to imagine the conditions for peace among all peoples and all cultures, beginning from a proper understanding of the religious phenomenon. Cusanus speaks as a Christian, and not merely as one Christian among the others, but as a cardinal deeply connected to the Roman Church. At the time of the fall of Constantinople, he was a close friend of Venice Piccolomini, who would become Pope Pius II in 1458. After the fall, Piccolomini wrote to Cusanus, urging him to use his writings to incite resistance against the Muslims. The Pace Fidei is Cusanus' polemical response to that request, a response that contradicts it and more broadly contradicts the entire warlike climate in which he lived. In this context, the Logos plays a crucial role, both as the Christian word of God and as the very principle of interreligious dialogue. The core of Cusanus' attempt is to show that every Logos, whether divine or human, is intrinsically a dialogos, since no word can ever fully express the ineffable nature of the divine principle. My aim today is to explore more concretely the meaning of this insight. The perspective of peace outlined by the Cardinal begins with a lucid awareness of the world dominated by war and conflict. There is no naive optimism in his thinking. Yet, through what is presented almost as a mystical ecstasy, imagines being lifted from the earthly to the heavenly realm. And you can see in text 1, which is the very beginning of the text, it starts exactly from the dramatic situation that Cusanus is living. Because Cusanus says that there was a certain man who, having formerly seen the sights in the regions of Constantinople, was inflamed with zeal for God as a result of those deeds that were reported to have been perpetrated at Constantinople most recently and most cruelly by King of the Turks. Consequently, with many groanings, he beseeched the Creator of all, because of his kindness, to restrain the persecution that was raging more fiercely that injured on account of the difference of right between the two religions. It came to pass that after a number of days, perhaps because of his prolonged incessant meditation, a vision was shown to him, to this same zealous man. So Cusanus is lifted from the earthly to the heavenly, and there, under the guidance of the divine word, representative of all religious traditions enter into dialogue. Cusanus de Pace Fidei is a summary of what Cusanus sees after he is lifted in this heavenly realm. He is the Son of God who leads this exchange, embodying an image of Christianity that is intrinsically open to other faiths. Through mutual listening, the representative of all religions can begin to grasp the true relationship that bind their traditions together. In this way, the word appears not only as the center of the dialogue, coordinating it, but also as a voice that acknowledges its own limits, and with them, its intrinsic need for dialogue with other divine words. From a Christian perspective, no matter how fiercely men fight, convinced that they are defending the true religions against false ones, a broader view of the history of religions reveals the fallacy of such behavior and instead points to the path of peace. For if one looks closely, one discovers that all religions have sought to express the one God, though in different ways. As Cusanus formulates in his well-known expression, there is una religione riconvarietà, which is text 2. Beyond the diversity of rites by which traditions distinguish themselves from one another, there is but one religion which all participate in a very Platonic way. Your participation is crucial in as we shall see, in Cusanus' project. In Cusanus, this una religio takes on meta-historical traits. It represents a single shared faith that serves as the unitary paradigm towards which the various religions of history converge. What we ordinarily call religions in our language, in Cusanus' terminology, are instead rites. Religion itself is unique, transcending all historical rites, which are to be understood as participation in the one religion. This project of interreligious peace is entirely built on this idea of a single religion, although its contours are far from immediately transparent. Their clarification requires a reflection on the truth value of Christian theology itself, undertaken in the light of Neoplatonic metaphysics of the ineffable God. For Plotinus words, and especially in its later forms with Proclus and Dionysius the Areopagite, who are Cusanus' main sources for the Platonic tradition, indeed his a crucial author for the reception of Protus, because he's the first author to deal with his commentary on the Parmenides. Ancient Neoplatonism had explicitly described the superabundance of the Ariton, of the ineffable God, lying beyond the very logical principle of scientific and philosophical discourse, and indeed beyond every human world. In text 3 and text 4, I put a couple of texts from Protus, which sounds like very much, and which express this kind of perspective, and even though it's not possible yet to dwell on them very close. For instance, at the end of the Parmenides, Protus argues that positive negation must be ultimately removed from the one, since it is inexpressible and unknowable, and in this regard explicitly invokes the principle of contradiction. In the text, he talks of axioms of contradiction, which for Protus are the principle of contradiction and a consequence of the exudent method, but he's referring in the last instance to the principle of contradiction, which is the grounding structure of science itself, arguing for the idea that in the last instance, the one is to be thought as beyond the principle of contradiction. Showing that at the level of the ineffable, neither affirmation nor negation applies. Both are equally false, because discourse itself has no hold here. Likewise, in the Theologia Platonica, in text 4, it stresses that discourse, when it tries to grasp ineffable, inevitably leads into impossibility, since every logos that approaches it ends up self-refuting and fighting against itself. Of course, in ancient Platonism, we don't have a systematical epistemological reflection. But what Cusanus does is starting radicalizing this metaphysics of the ineffable God. He establishes a distinction between the laws of thought and the laws of reality, a distinction that would later prove crucial for modern philosophy. Since all reality derives from an ineffable God, which is transcended but also immanent in every level of reality, for Cusanus, all knowledge becomes conjectural, meaning that it partakes of truth only to otherness, which is spy. It's why we have the famous the definition, the best definition of conjecture for Cusanus. For Cusanus, conjecture is a positive assertion, autoritaria verità del motives participans. So it always partakes of truth, but it's never identical to truth itself, which is God. Every religion and for him, all knowledge is conjectural, and therefore also every religious knowledge is conjectural. Yet this epistemology of conjecture does not imply relativism. Each logos can participate in truth through two different degrees. It does, however, entail that no knowledge, not even Christian theology, can ever coincide, be identical with divine truth. On one hand, the uniqueness of Christianity in relation to all other religions, traditions, is undeniable, as shown by the fact that it is the world who leads the dialogue with them in the Pace Fidei. On the other hand, in the very course of this dialogue, the world demonstrates an awareness of the paraphernalia of Christian theology, and thus its very framework must ultimately be surpassed, insofar as one turns to the divine principle in its most primal and proper reality. The project of peace set forth in the Pace Fidei is grounded in this idea of a divine principle venerated by human religion, which ultimately surpasses all of its historical expressions. At the same time, however, this project remains firmly rooted in history, of which the meta-historical divine principle constitutes the unitary order and source. In the closing line of the text, in this text 6, Cusanus imagines all the wise men in religious matter from different nations sitting at a table, holding ancient books that contain material information about their respective traditions. In this way, the wise men would concretely recognize that behind the various cults, even if often obscured from the many, who tend instead towards idolatry, all different traditions have presupposed a single God, worshipping him in different forms at different times. And I quote from the text: after these topics were discussed, the foregoing way, the wise men of the nations, they were exhibited very many books authored by those who had written about the observance of the ancient, excellent books indeed in every language, as for example, among the late Marcus Varro, Eusebius. After this writing were examined, it was ascertained that the entire diversity among the religions lay in the rites rather than in the worship of one God. From all the writings which had been collected into one, it was learned that since at the very beginning all men have always presupposed God and worshipped him in all their religious practices. Obviously, Cusanus preferred the religious traditionalist Christianity, yet he is equally aware of its limitations and of the need for dialogue with other traditions, and it's shared by all religious traditions, really because of their conjectural nature. If such a dialogue were to occur, Cusanus explicitly states, the sword will cease, as will also the malice of hatred and all evils, and all men will know that there is only one religion in a variety of rites. To achieve this, the Cardinal proposes a reinterpretation of the universal history of religions. This requires a philological and material study of the historical sources, interpreted, however, from the vantage point of the human religion and understood as diverse manifestations of its unity. So we can see now the new Platonic structure of this idea, this dialectic between the one and the many. This conception, expressed through the imagery of the book invoked at the end of the Pace Fidei, stands within a typical humanistic conception of philology, this kind of love for logos. At last, from an ideal standpoint, it situates Cusanus within the tradition of Italian humanism, anticipating the philosophy of peace later developed by Ficino and Pico da Milan. Through the Pace Fidei, Cusanus thus investigates the theoretical foundations of universal history of religions, grounded in Platonic metaphysics. One can therefore appreciate the reason for his enduring relevance in the contemporary debate on the history of religions. It's no coincidence that Julian Rees, one of its foremost representatives, when discussing the Pace Fidei and referring to the doctrine of man as homo religiosus, particularly as developed famously by Mircea Eliade, remarked that this Cusanus text remains a model for those who in our time believe in the constructive work of the various authentic humanisms founded on homo religiosus and his experience of the sacred. The dream of universal peace outlined in the Pace Fidei is articulated through a series of arguments by which Cusanus seeks to design a complex harmonization of Christianity with other religious traditions. The Cardinal does not limit his view to the religions of the book, although he gives particular attention to Islam, given the historical context of the text Genesis, with Judaism playing a more secondary role, but also consider polytheistic traditions. His attempt to construct the framework for such universal peace between monotheism and polytheism is especially developed in the chapter 6 of the Pace Fidei. Here, he recounts a dialogue between the world and an Islamic sage. Responding to the sage's question, and it's the text 7, the world, expressing Cusanus' own perspective, addresses the problem of finding a common framework that includes not only the religions of the book, but which share the belief in one God, the unam absolutum sapienza, questus Deus, but also the pagan traditions. There I asked the word, how is it, I asked, that the worshippers of more than one God are in agreement with the philosophers with regard to the belief in one God? How is it possible, in other terms, that how can the worshippers of many gods converge with philosophers on the idea of one God? To solve this problem, which is essential for a theoretical peace among all religions, Cusanus develops a systematic approach characterized by a methodical henotheistic principle that transcends the opposition between monotheism and polytheism. In his view, there is in fact no such a thing as a genuine polytheism. Indeed, by worshipping the individual deities of the pantheon, pagans were in reality venerating the one archetypical divinity in its manifold manifestations. You can appreciate even here how the Neoplatonic interpretation of polytheism is crucial for Cusanus. And I quote again from the text: all who have ever worshipped a plurality of gods have presupposed there to be a deity. For all the gods, they adore the deity as one and the same in all its participants. As he had already argued in the Doctrina Ignorantia, Cusanus does not consider this true of all pagans, certainly not of those who gave themselves over to idolatry. Yet beyond the religiosity of the common people, according to an initiatory conception of theology that Cusanus often adopts, the early theologians were aware of this metaphysical structure. Subtly but persistently, it operates at the very heart of theology, always shaped by the dialectical relation between the one and the many. Similarly, for the Carnian, there is not even a pure and proper empty monotheism. Even within Christian theology, there is not only the one God, but also the saints who must be regarded as his manifestation. And quoting from the text, therefore, the worshipping of a plurality of gods, we speak of the deity. And he who says that there is more than one God says implicitly that there is antecedently one beginning of them all. Just as who maintains that there is more than one holy man admits that there is one most holy by participating in him. All these others are holy. Qui dice plures Deos, dicit unum antecedente omnium principium, sicut qui esserit plures esse sanctos unum sanctum sanctorum, cui participazione omne sancti sunt admittunt. Cusanus, following an argumentative strategy he would continue to employ throughout his career, even later, turns here to the ontological dimension, whose structure mirrors for him that of pagan mythology. Fundamental sources of this conception are Proclus and Dionysius, the Areopagus. Proclus had articulated a system in which the pagan deities are manifestations of the unique God identified with one good. Dionysius, in turn, himself influenced by Proclus, conceived the angelic world in analogous terms, even though emphasizing more than Proclus the preeminence of the first principle of the creator with respect to the other deities. While in Proclus you have more emphasis on the action of the individual gods. From Proclus, Dionysius adopted the idea of a triadic structure of the intelligible order and transported into Christian theology, presenting the angelical hierarchies as a manifestation of the one God. In both cases, the divine is ineffable and yet manifests itself in a structural multiplicity of gods or angels. This Neoplatonic perspective provides Cusanus with the ideal hermeneutical keys for his project of peace. For this show, the pagan and Christian theology share the same underlying structure, an ineffable one expressing itself in manifold of theophanies. It is a primordial science articulated through a divine logos, expressed then in different forms. Yet the Christian logos is distinguished by its unique character. It's not inferior to the Father, and at the same time, it's both God and man, of course, thus constituting the perfect bond between the creature and the creator. What Cusanus does in relation to these Neoplatonic sources, however, is distinctive. He does not accept their metaphysical hierarchies as real levels of being. Rather, he conjecturalizes them. That is, he transforms what for Proclus and Dionysius had been metaphysical structure into epistemic ones, and thus into forms of human logos. The pagan pantheon and Christian angelology are no longer ontological orders, but are symbolic maps. As he says in text A, they are conjecture fluxibiles, they are fluid conjectures, through which the human mind, historically situated, seeks to represent the ineffable divine principle. In this way, Cusanus lowers Neoplatonic metaphysics onto the historical plane. The hierarchies of God and angels are interpreted as expression of humanity's conjectural effort to articulate the one-many dialectic of the divine, and each tradition depicting in its own way the ineffable mystery. This shift allows him to relativize every particular religion's language without falling into relativism, since all share in the same structure of participation. It also enables him to outline on the Platonic foundations the principle of a universal comparative history of religion. The source of this Cusanus argument Platonic is made clear by his vocabulary, which explicitly invokes the notion of participation to describe the relationship between the different gods and one archetypical deity. Indeed, as we've seen in text 6, he says that in all the gods, they adore the deity as one and the same in all its participants. Seen in this slide, the logos itself, the word that coordinates the dialogue in the Pacifide, emerges as the hermeneutical principle that gathers these conjectural representations into conversation. Each divine word expresses only a fragment, a conjecture of the ineffable, and it's precisely through their dialogues that Cusanus envisions peace among religions. However, Cusanus' discourse does not end here. The dialogue that follows the exchange with the Arab, the word converses with the Indian, continuing to explore the problem of the relationship between polytheism and the Christian tradition. At this stage, however, the crucial issue concerns the very identity of the one God worshipped by the una religio in ritum varietate. Indeed, in pagan Neoplatonism, which provides Cusanus with the hermeneutical keys to interpret pagan religions, the divine principle is absolutely one, simple, ineffable, and parallel to any form of rationality. Asked. By contrast, the Christian God is intrinsically Trinitarian. Thus, the Indian, who here takes on the role of defending a paganizing analogical synchronism, poses the decisive question. How can universal peace among different religious traditions be achieved if Christianity disagrees with them precisely on the fundamental point of the nature of God? Which is text 9. Okay. Maybe no? I can put it. Says the Indian, with regard to a triune God, it will be very difficult for harmony to be accepted everywhere, for it will seem too odd that a Trinity cannot be conceived apart from three. Now, if in the deity there is a Trinity, there will be also a plurality in the deity. But previously it was said, and indeed it must be the case, that there is only one absolute deity, unam deitatem absolutam. Therefore, the plurality is not present in the absolute deity, but in the participants who are not God absolutely, but are God by participation. There is one absolute deitas, according to what Cusanus states through the Indian. Here we are dealing with a dimension of the divine that precedes Deus himself, and therefore he is the personal God. A conception of the relationship between Deitas and Deus also confirmed in the Cribratio Corani. This work composed by Cusanus between 1460 and 61, at the request of his old friend, again, Piccolomini, now Pope Pius II, was intended as an analysis of the Islamic religion. In the text, which is text 10, he says, making also explicit reference to Dionysius. Now, this beginning is principium. The translator Hopkins, who is translated John's words, translated with beginning, but it's principle, it's principium. Now, this beginning can be considered without respect to things originated, so that it is as much not beginning as beginning. For this reason, it is altogether infinite and boundless, incomprehensible and ineffable. Surely, then, since it surpasses all the senses and every intellect and every name and everything nameable, it is not said to be one or three, or good, or wise, or Father, or Son, or Holy Spirit. And the case is similar as regards whatever can be spoken or taught, even as Dionysius the Areopagite teaches that God infinitely accepts and precedes all such names. In the passage to which Cusanus is referring, which is text 11, taken from the conclusion of the Mystica Theologia, Dionysius denies of God every attribute, including divinity, goodness, spirit, filiation, and paternity. Theotes, agatotes, pneuma, uiotes, patrotes. In Traversalis Latin, deitas, bonitas, spiritus, filius, and pater. Ambrogio Traversalis translation of the Corpus Initium was made in 1436 and was Cusanus had many translations of the Corpus Initium, but the Traversalis one was the one he relied more on. More broadly, although it is not possible here to examine the issue fully, the His theology articulates a dimension of the divine that precedes even the Trinity itself, the idea of hypertheos theotes, of super divine Godhead. While affirming God's literal manifestation, he simultaneously places at the very origin a reality beyond even relation, echoing the Neoplatonic idea of the one. Of course, we know that Dionysius was very likely scholar, student of Proclus in the Neoplatonic school of Athens, and its kind of influence remained even in the Corpus Elysium, even in mixed and in a Christian theological context. Plotinus takes up this Dionysian heritage, mixing with Proclus himself. And he's the first author. Is also very interesting because he's the first author in the history of Latin thought that who read Dionysius together with Proclus, which is what we do nowadays from more or less one century. Cusanus takes up this Dionysian heritage and radicalizes it by conjecturalizing all theological discourse. Even Trinitarian theology is only a conjectural symbol of the ineffable principle, which surpasses every affirmation and every negation. This systematic development of the metaphysics of the ineffable carries radical consequences for any theological discourse, whether henological, Trinitarian, or eschatological. The other gods that participate in this status absoluta, according to the Platonic conception of polytheism we have already seen. If this is the case, how can there be a divine principle that is both one and triune? To this question, the word himself gives a clear and highly significant answer, which is the last text of the endowment. Says Cusanus, through the word, as creator, God is trine and one. As infinite, is neither trine nor one, nor any of those things that can be spoken of. For the names that are ascribed to God are taken from creatures, since in himself God is in himself ineffable and beyond all that can be named or spoken of. Nam nomina fidei attribuuntur, sum montro creaturis, cum ipse sint in se ineffabilis et super omnes quod dominari audici posset. Thus the simple beginning principle of the universe is triune. Moreover, because that which is originated is supposed to be unfolded in the beginning, and because whatever is originated attests likewise that it is unfolded in its beginning, then some such trine distinction is also found in a oneness of essence in every originated thing. If from the most simple beginning of all things will also be inferable to be trine in one. Here is emphasized that God can be understood in Trinitarian terms, only in the context of its relationship with creatures. We find ourselves, in fact, within affirmative theology, by virtue of which we think of God in its resemblance to creation. As already in the Doctrina Ignorantia, Cusanus here develops the idea of an analogy between the metaphysical and cosmological dimensions and the Trinitarian one. The Trinitarian structure is present in every being, insofar as it belongs to every creature, and insofar as it belongs to every creature, must also be attributed to the Creator. In the Doctrina Ignorantia, in the second book, he has the idea that every created being is considered by form and matter in their nexus, where each belongs to. So it's a mirror of the Trinity. However, when one turns to Deitas Absoluta and its abysmal initiality, one must say that being unnameable, it also transcends Trinitarian theology itself. In other words, the Cusanian Luna Religio, though grounded in Christianity, appears here to construct its religiosity on a syncretistic and Platonic framework that entails the relativization of Christian theology, even while recognizing Christianity as the tradition which, within these religions, understood as rights, participating in the Luna Religio, has come closest to the mystery of the divine. As a pragmatic expression of the fine ridge on which Cusanus' thought moves, it is the word himself, in dialogue with the Indian, who declares the incompleteness of Trinitarian theology with respect to the ineffable deity, thereby also acknowledging within the Pace Fide itself the conjectural nature of his own speaking in the name of the divine principle. This Cusanian stance, confirmed also in later writings such as the mentioned Ribazzo Corani, revives a Dionysian form of Trinitarian theology that strives to imagine the divine principle prior to its very constitution as creator and as Trinitarian. What occurs here in Cusanus is the development of this Dionysian and ultimately Platonic approach on the historical plane. Indeed, it underpins a syncretistic project which, once theology is freed from the hubris of claiming to exhaust the depths of divine dogmatically, opens the way for authentic intelligible dialogue. And I'm causing to end my speech. Cusanus' reflections on intelligible dialogue and on the role of Christianity within it offer a striking example of the intellectual freedom that marked Renaissance philosophy in the 15th century. As a gathering closely tied to the Roman Church, he composed the Pace Fide envisioning a perspective in which the Christian world himself calls for intelligible dialogue, not only for the sake of the other tradition, but for Christianity as well. For Cusanus, no word, whether human or divine, can adequately speak the ineffable God. All knowledge, even scripture itself, is conjectural, a symbolic pointing toward the divine, which always surpasses every form of language. It is in this spirit that all traditions must engage in dialogue, recognizing the way beyond history requires the soul to be exercised through every human attempt to reach the divine. Ultimately, the encounter with God, lies beyond all speech and beyond every tradition in mystical science. Yet, before reaching that science, the logos, in all its form, must be pressed to its very limits. Thanks.
Thank you, Paolo. Some questions already, I think. Matthew?
Yes, thank you. First of all, and not to be pedantic, but your Italian and your Latin is very good, but you should be very careful about Jasper Hopkins' translations of Cusanus. I don't think they're very good, frankly.
Yeah, the Hopkins ones. Yeah.
Yes, the Hopkins, they're not very. Can we see the Latin of 12, actually?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. My real question, I don't want to start reading and then but my question is about the word religio, because perhaps not a question, because, you know, when I started studying in institutions run by or associated with the Church of England, I started hearing the word religion a lot more than I had in my earlier Catholic experience. And I've always been puzzled, you know, religious studies, and then you have this, you know, after the Reform and in English theology, you have this word religion that comes up, and that just is not, you know, in the Latin of Aquinas, religion is a virtue, and then we're done and over with it. Now, Cusanus is different, and here we have religio that comes up and plays this role, and I'd just like you to think with you for a minute about what we mean by this, because we're in this sort of apophatic mode of doing theology and then trying to find a place for dialogue and not presuming that we know what the other knows. And I'm always thinking, when I think of Cusanus, about the beautiful preface to De Visione Dei, where you have the sort of translatio from, you know, one monk sees the icon, the omnivoyant moves around, sees the icon, follows him, and then there's sort of an announcing of the word. Did you see what I saw? So this is translatio of a sort of a moment that is not just vertical movement. I wonder, so I always thought sort of the moment of religio for in a Cusanian frame, but this text, which I have not seen in a very long time, De Pace Fidei, seems to be doing something else with religio. So what does this word mean? And I know we know about, you know, Augustine and Cicero, and I think we all know that, you know, but what for Cusanus, what does this word mean?
Many thanks for the question, Matthew. It's not. I mean, it's very interesting and complex question, because my impression in the Pace Fidei, you have the idea of una religion is of course it's like a unique religion. It's very difficult to identify the content of this religion. My impression is that first, in the text you have usually speaks about una religio and distinguish it with the rites. So it's kind of religion is something which is beyond history in a sense, and sometimes he also speaks of religiones in the plural form. It's like if the rites were a kind of participation in the una religio. I have the impression that in Cusanus the una religio is this kind of parallel to which all the historical doctrines about God are related. It's framed in a very Platonic context, and but this would be my answer. I mean, the problem is that understanding how should this religion be structured, because there is always this tension between the comparison between historical doctrines and the real content of this religion, which is, in a sense, seems to be even beyond historical Christian doctrines. I mean, in this context of, because there is a text which is not very known, but it's very interesting, Dialogues de Genesi, a very small text in the quoted in 1447, where he discusses the book, the Genesis. I mean, he discusses the problem of the Genesis of things, and he uses also Moses, but there he explicitly says that Moses himself spoke with conjectures.
To follow up on Matthew's point, this is a a very radically intellectualized understanding of what religion is, because it's all about the knowledge of truth. So he seems to see, well, he mentions rights, but what is the function of these rights? So it's an amazing text, because he was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, but and he read Prologue with theurgy, and Prologue believes that knowledge amounts nothing to salvation, as far as I understand him. So okay, even if that is true, that all religions participate in one, but what about the salvific power of religion? After all, in the Prologue of John, it said clearly that the Word gave us the power to become the children of God. So it's not about the revelation of truth; it's about the transmission of power. So theurgy and sacraments are, I think, key to religion, and he seems to ignore that completely. He seems to be only interested in the knowledge of truth. So I guess this was your point, because it also is my point. Yes, with all my sympathy to Cusanus, I mean, does he believe that knowledge saves, which is completely unchristian? Or what's the place of sacraments? That there is nothing about sacraments.
I mean, if point is that if you look, I mean, it's a very interesting point, because it's also, I think, the one of the point of difference of Cusanus with respect to Ficino or Pico. I mean that if we read the sermons, they are different from the published works. But in the works he writes and publishes, Cusanus is very intellectual. Has a very intellectual approach to it. Indeed, he wrote the Pacifide like. The passage from the end of the text, when he said, "Okay, let's take the ancient books, and we compare the doctrines," but he does not do that. I mean, it's like it's kind of a project, but if you look at his works, it's very dialectical. There is not. I mean, it's very about philosophical reason and talking about. So I would say that. In principle, the concrete study of the religious phenomenon is, and also religious practice, is part of his project of peace. Because of course, his project of peace demands that there is every single culture and people remains with its own right. But
what is the function of the rights? Does he say anything about
the function of the rights? It's also complicated, because sometimes he seems to say, okay, maybe it's better to go beyond the rights, but sometimes he says no. If we have different rights, we can. The point is that for bring the rights that is that since in history it is not possible to arrive to human religion. What we have to do is that understanding, for him, right, is kind of is connected to knowledge. That's the point. I mean, we have to know each the rights of the other people, because if knowing, having dialogue with other doctrines, we come closer to a God which is not cannot be expressed fully by our tradition, by our right. But it's very.
So religion is only assent for him. Human assent to God. There is no.
No, the consequence is the fact that if we understand our relationship with the sacred in the proper manner, we start to fight with other peoples and traditions, think that we are right and they are wrong. So the concrete consequence is this one. For me, he sees that that word is. He sees that Christians wants to fight against Muslims and the opposite. And he thinks that if you understand in a proper manner our relationship with the sacred, you should not do that. That's the concrete consequence. But of course, the problem is there's not a lot of how realizing it historically. It's because it's very theoretical. Because it's very connected to knowledge. That's the point that he
Or because it's unrelated to religion. That's the he's talking about the peace between religions without. He's not talking about actual religions at all. Well. Of course, we're not talking about this historical text. I'm curious about your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean the point is it's very abstract. That's the point.
Is this sort of a propedeutic to theology of revelation? Before we talk about revelation, here are sort of the transcendental or the human possibilities of conceiving of the divine, whereby we see that we are all equal and we can all have a relationship with God. And then after that, you would have to do the good Cusanus stuff we see in the well-known works, you know, where you have a Trinitarian theology and a theology of revelation and all these things. I'm just trying to think about what he's doing here. Like, what is this for?
It's kind of setting the basis for people to do after him the kind of historical path. But the thing is that if in order to understand the kind of also person that Cusanus was, he uses the word to express his own perspective. So it's not very there's not much humility, in this kind of perspective. That's the point. It's for him. If you look at history of religions in its complexity, you will find that the God he has been searching for has been searched by all the other people. That's the point. It's very centered on what he thinks of his conjecture. He does not think that he said the truth in a definite manner, but his conjecture where he believes that were the best he found, I think.
We should move on soon, but since our next speaker has just disappeared, one more question from.
Well, I thank you very much for such a stimulating talk, and I, as I said previously, I think that the organizers should be praised for such an initiative, in that it's such a diverse series of talks, and so thank you for such a stimulating talk, Paolo. I'm curious, just reading this passage as a patristics doctoral student, there seems to be a lot of Dionysius underlying this, as you alluded to in this passage, unde quia deum colentes ipsum, etc., multitudo inequalitas exageratio, multitudo enim stellarum arborum, the multitude of stars and of trees and of men and of stones, etc. The unity and multiplicity question seems to be a direct allusion to Celestial Hierarchy 12. And I'm curious to know, because there's a long debate about Celestial Hierarchy 12 in the scholastic period, where you have Aquinas commenting on it in Summa Theologica, prima pars 155, and in De Veritate, question 8, answers to 10 to 11, and then Scotus commenting in Ordinatio as well, precisely on this passage in response to Aquinas. I'm only alluding to these passages because there seems to be a lot of scholastic thought that Cusa seems at the very least aware of, because the discussion about religio and about all of these things and about rights it seems is grounded in a metaphysical question about the one and the many. So I wanted to broaden the question out a little bit from questions of rights and of modern concerns to sort of a more textual question, because you've got this beautiful Latin passage up here, and I'm curious to know what you think in terms of resonances with Dionysius, Areopagite, and of the earlier sort of scholastic period as well.
Thanks. Of course, Cusanus had if you could give me the passage from Aquinas, with then later.
Yes, and of Scotus as well. It's really interesting, because this is one of the passages where Aquinas takes the word holos and says the superior angels. This is about the angelology debates, right? But it's angelology in the scholastic period is code for questions about the one and the many. The forms in the earlier Proclean works become angels. So the superior angels have more universal science than inferior ones. This is him quoting off of Dionysius. But Scotus will say, well, the Bishop of Lincoln in the previous year has translated anew. So holos is not just to do with totality of species, universality, but of totality. So holos should be translated in a different way. It's actually what Scotus says. It's very interesting sort of passage in Ordinatio. I'm very happy to share this with you afterwards. But I just think that there's very interesting resonances here that are probably worth exploring. As reception of Dionysius goes, Cusa is not coming at this presumably from a vacuum, but coming also from the scholastic period. So I just curious to know if there's some engagement with the scholastics happening in terms
thanks. I will be very brief because we have Douglas. But regarding the relationship between Cusanus and scholasticism is very interesting. The point is that in his perspective, he wants to break with the mainstream Dionysian tradition in the Middle Ages. He likes the tradition that goes through Origen. But when he was young, he studied in the Albertist tradition, but then he started criticizing the Albertist tradition. He works a lot, and there are also the marginalia to his commentary, to his manuscripts of the commentary on by Albertus Magnus. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting in his reception of Dionysius that he wants to read it as an ancient author. Because I mean, there's the idea that he was inspired by Plato and that he inspired Proclus later. Because of course he thinks that he lived in the 1st century, so it's kind of. But he reads in the context of ancient New Platonism. I mean, he's the first to do that explicitly. But thanks for the question.